In the silent corners of Asia, where incense curls into forgotten rafters and the past never sleeps, the dead do not always rest beneath the soil. Some whisper through cracked walls, some mourn in temple winds, and some cry from the very food we eat. Welcome to Whispers of Asia, where every story is an echo of the old world, steeped in sacred rituals, lost names, and haunted truths. Tonight's tale comes from the mist-veiled rice fields of northern Vietnam, where comfort turns to curse, and the hunger of the dead is never truly gone. This is The Rice That Cried at Night. In the northern highlands of Vietnam, where fog clings to the rice terraces like forgotten prayers, the nights arrive quietly, but they do not come alone. The villagers of Ban Morung say that after harvest season, the wind carries more than cold. It brings voices, faint, brittle, like breath escaping from beneath the earth. But Thi Luen, a widow of 63, paid no attention to such things. She had no time for ghosts, only rice, chores, and silence. Her home sat alone at the edge of the paddies, wooden stilts raising it just above the damp soil. There, surrounded by the golden remnants of harvested grain, she lived in solitude since her son's death 2 months ago. He was the last of her family, gone from a fever that struck suddenly and left no time for proper rites. She had buried him alone. The priest was away, and no one came to help. His body was wrapped in a blanket and laid beneath the tamarind tree, just like her husband before him. No chants, no offerings, only the sound of dirt falling over regret. That night, the night it began, she lit a single candle and ate coiled rice with pickled mustard greens. The wind had picked up outside, rustling the banana trees. Rain tapped gently on the palm-thatched roof. And then the sound came. At first it was soft, a faint, breathy whimper, like a child crying into a pillow. Thi Luen paused mid-chew, listening. It was not from outside. It was above her, in the rafters. She turned her head slowly, heart knocking against her ribs. Her house had always creaked in the wind, but this was not the groan of aged wood. It was a sound that carried grief, low, rhythmic, sad. She stood up with effort and reached for the old oil lantern. The flame flickered as she climbed the wooden ladder into the attic space. Just bundles of rice stalks, tools, a rusted sickle. Nothing. No one. She came back down, muttering to herself. Just the wind, nothing else, just wind. But the moment she stepped back into her room, the candle had gone out, and the bowl of rice, which had been steaming warm minutes ago, had turned cold and pale. She didn't eat the rest. She placed it on the altar instead and whispered her son's name. But even the incense stick refused to stay lit. The next morning, Luen brushed it off. She told herself it had all been fatigue. She hadn't slept well in weeks. Grief does strange things to the mind. Still, when she scooped rice for breakfast, she noticed something odd. The rice had spoiled. Not in the usual way, not from warmth or age. It had blackened, as if singed from the inside. A sour, metallic smell rose from the pot. It reminded her of rusted nails left in water. Worse, there were red streaks running through the clumps, almost like veins. She gagged and threw it out into the field. Then she took her jar and scrubbed it clean with lye and salt. She refilled it with new rice from a sealed bag. "Clean rice, clean soul," she said out loud, trying to calm herself. "Old people always say so." By noon, she had forgotten the whole thing, until night fell. That night, the weeping returned, louder, closer. This time, it wasn't from the rafters. It was from the kitchen. She crept across the wooden floor, the lantern casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The crying had turned into soft gasps, like someone choking down sobs trying not to be heard. Her rice jar stood in the corner of the room, wrapped in a checkered cloth. She hesitated. The crying stopped. Her ears rang with silence. She opened the lid. Nothing. Just the dry, white grains, smooth and silent. And then she saw it. One grain, moving, squirming, as if trying to escape. She screamed and slammed the lid shut. The next morning, she visited Batu, the oldest living woman in the village. Blind, shriveled, and sharp-tongued, Batu had survived 4 husbands and 2 wars. If anyone knew about strange things, it was her. Kom Vong, the old woman whispered after Luen told her what she'd seen. What? Ghost rice, the food of the forgotten, the cursed. Spirits cling to it when they are denied offerings. It becomes their voice, their grief. Di Luen felt her throat tighten. But I offered food. I lit incense. Not to them, she hissed. To your family, yes, but not to them. Not the ones who were buried without names. You have awakened something. How? Where did your son harvest this season? Di Luen faltered. He cleared the south edge of the field, where the grasses grew tall. It was good land, untouched. Untouched for a reason, Batu said darkly. During the old plague, that land was used as a burial trench. Dozens died nameless. No priest, no chant, no ancestor fire. But that was generations ago. The hungry dead don't count years, the old woman said, leaning closer. They only count bowls. That night, Luen cooked instant noodles instead of rice, but the weeping still came. And when she looked into the pot of boiled water, she saw a single grain floating there, blackened, red-veined, as if it had swum there from some memory long forgotten. She threw the pot out the window. The air that night was heavy, thick with dampness and rot. She couldn't sleep. She sat near her altar, clutching a rosary her mother gave her, though she hadn't prayed to Catholic saints in decades. At 2 a.m., the crying began again, but this time it wasn't soft. It was screaming, raw, desperate, as if someone buried alive had just clawed their way to the lid and found it sealed tight. The rice jar shook violently. The cloth slipped off. Blood began to seep from beneath the lid. And Luen, frozen in the corner of her home, realized something unholy had crossed her threshold. Not a ghost, not a memory, something older, something starving, something that had once been human, but had long since forgotten what warmth or love, or a name even, meant. And she had fed it. The next morning, the jar was clean. Not a drop of blood, not a stain, as if the screaming night had been nothing but a dream. But Ti Lun knew better. She had not slept. She had not even dared to close her eyes. She had sat in her prayer corner until the roosters crowed, waiting for the sun to dissolve whatever darkness had crept into her home. It hadn't. She could feel it still. Not in the walls, not in the shadows, but in the jar. Something lingered. It didn't move, it didn't speak, but it watched. That day, she did not touch the rice. She swept the yard 3 times. She burned offerings at the village shrine and whispered apologies into the smoke, hoping some spirit might overhear. She even carved a wooden name tablet and placed it on her family altar, a blank one for the nameless. "Whoever you are," she whispered, "I see you now. I offer this bowl. I offer this name." She left a dish of sticky rice and salted fish beneath the altar, lit a candle, and bowed 3 times. Nothing happened. Not at first, but when the candle burned low, she saw it flicker sideways, as if something had breathed across it. She looked down at the offering bowl. The rice was gone. Not eaten, not scattered. Gone, as if the bowl had never been filled. She stared, chilled to the bone. And then she heard it again, behind her, from the kitchen. A low, wet sobbing. Not in the air, not in the walls, but from inside the jar. Luen didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her spine stiffened with ancestral fear, the kind passed down through lullabies and warnings, the kind no logic can soften. Then slowly, the sobbing grew louder. It rose from whimpers to gasps, from gasps to desperate, rasping grief, like a child abandoned in a grave, begging for warmth it had never known. Her feet moved on their own. Step by step, she crossed the floor until she stood before the rice jar. The lid trembled. Her hands shook as she lifted the cloth. The ceramic lid was steaming, not with heat, but with cold. Condensation dripped from its rim. Her breath fogged the air, though it was summer. She reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was rice. Not raw, not dry. Cooked, but soaked in a deep red broth. Not blood, not quite. Something thinner, like memory turned liquid. And the rice moved, squirmed. It shivered as if alive. Then, slowly, it released a sound that should never come from food. A sigh. Wet, hollow, ancient. Luen slammed the lid back down and collapsed. She awoke to the sound of flies, hundreds of them buzzing around the walls, the ceiling, the altar. They had gathered around the rice bowl offering. The fish had rotted. The candle was still burning, untouched, but the rice had turned black. Black and wet. Thick like mud dredged from a riverbed. She threw everything outside and began scrubbing her altar with salt water and vinegar, whispering prayers she barely remembered. The next morning, the village priest returned. She went to him immediately. Father Hong was a young man, barely 30, too modern, she thought, too soft for this place. But desperation made her humble. "Something is wrong with my rice," she told him, hands shaking. "You mean it's gone bad?" "It's cursed," she said quietly. He tried to hide his smile. He offered to come by after his rounds. She waited, all day, scrubbed every surface, burned old sage and wormwood, even recited old Catholic prayers. When he finally arrived near dusk, she showed him the jar. He lifted the lid, paused. His face paled. "This rice isn't just rotten," he whispered. "It's spoiled from within. It smells like something dead. It was clean yesterday. I swear on my ancestors. I didn't cook it. I didn't touch it. I haven't eaten a single bowl." Father Hone hesitated. Then gently, he reached in with 2 fingers. The moment he touched the rice, he gasped and stumbled back. "What did you see?" Luen asked. He didn't answer. His eyes had gone glassy, unfocused. He stood for a moment silent, then without a word, he turned and left the house. She never saw him again. That night, she heard that he had packed his bags and left the village, saying only, "There's something old there, older than my God." The following days blurred. She stopped cooking. She stopped eating. Every time she stepped into the kitchen, the rice jar was full again. No matter how many times she emptied it,
buried it, or smashed it. Once she tossed it into the river. The next morning it was back in its place, clean, whole, covered again in the checkered cloth. It had become part of her home, like a shrine or a wound. One night, after 3 days of no food, hunger overtook her. She lit a fire, boiled water, and, against every scream in her soul, reached into the jar. The rice inside was warm, soft, and smelled sweet, like the rice her mother used to make. Tears fell down her cheeks, her hands trembled, her belly ached with emptiness. She took a bite, chewed slowly. It tasted like her childhood. But as she swallowed, a wave of heat surged through her chest, her ears rang, her vision blurred. And then, she was no longer in her kitchen. She was underground, alone, buried, mouth full of soil, chest crushed by weight, hands clawing upward, eyes swollen shut from infection. She screamed, but no air came out. Only mud, only memory, only pain. And then she was back, collapsing to the floor, vomiting onto the wooden planks. The rice jar sat quietly in the corner, unmoved, unbothered, but not innocent. Never again, she swore. Never again would she eat from it, but the hunger would return, and with it, the memories of those who died starving. And she, who had never known famine, would become their vessel, their voice, their tongue, and their grief.
The villagers spoke of it only in whispers, usually after too much rice wine, when the oil lamps burned low and the shadows on the walls began to resemble people who were no longer alive. They called it komvong, ghost rice. Not rice haunted by a single spirit, not even cursed by a witch or wronged ancestor. This rice was worse. It belonged to no one and everyone, a vessel for the forgotten, a graveyard in every grain. Ti Luen sat outside her house, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the fields that stretched to the tree line. The same fields her son had harvested just weeks before he died, healthy, smiling, proud. Now he was a box of ashes, resting on her altar in silence. She remembered his voice, bright and eager, as he returned from the fields that day. The southern corner grew thick this year, May. The soil's darker there, rich. It fed the rice better than anywhere else. And she had smiled, proud, grateful, unknowing. That corner had always been avoided by older farmers, not because of superstition, but because the soil was too soft. They said your feet sank deeper there. It clung to you, like hands. Luen never asked why, not until now. She returned to Batu's hut. The old woman was waiting for her, sitting beneath bundles of herbs and red string. You fed them, Batu rasped, before Luen could speak. Who? The nameless, the ones buried without words. You ate their memories. It was only one bite. One is enough. The old woman's face was stone, but her cloudy eyes seemed to flicker. They're inside you now. Each grain holds a death, and they've been waiting for someone to listen. Luen sat down hard on the dirt floor. Why were they never buried properly? There was a plague before even my grandmother's time. Whole families died in days. So many bodies, too many to bless, too many to name. They were taken to the southern edge
and thrown into a trench. No fire, no chanting, just dirt and fear. But why did no one tell me? Because no one remembers. The dead were forgotten, and now they remember themselves through you. That night, Luyenne dreamed of the trench. She saw it clearly, saw men in straw hats carrying wrapped corpses, saw women weeping into scarves, pressing their dead children into mats of bamboo, saw bodies stacked like firewood, faces bloated, eyes open. And then she saw herself, standing at the edge of the pit, holding a bowl of rice, not to eat, but to offer. The spirits inside the trench reached up, mouths open, but every time they took a bite, they turned to ash, and the ash turned to grain, and the grain returned to her jar. She woke up screaming. Her mouth tasted like metal. There was dirt under her fingernails, and beside her bed was a single cooked grain of rice, red-streaked, beating faintly like a tiny heart. The next day, she sealed the rice jar shut with wax and string. She buried it in the earth beneath the tamarind tree where her son had been laid to rest. She said every prayer she could remember, Buddhist, Catholic, even the old mountain chants her grandmother used to mutter in her sleep. She wept, she begged, and she waited. But that night, the jar was back, on its shelf, unopened, clean, full. She took a kitchen knife and smashed it. Ceramic shattered across the floor. Grains flew into every corner. She swept them up, burned them in her fire pit, scattered the ashes into the stream, and went to sleep, relieved, until she opened her eyes the next morning and found the jar sitting at the foot of her bed, perfect, whole, untouched. Luyenne no longer screamed. She simply stared. She placed her hand on the lid and whispered, "What do you want?" The jar did not answer, but her stomach did. It growled, low, insistent, hungry. She had not eaten in 2 days, and the rice smelled sweet again. She carried the jar to her altar, lit 3 sticks of incense, bowed deeply. "If you are the nameless, I offer this meal to you." She scooped out a bowl, placed it before the blank wooden tablet, and sat beside it, and waited. The candle flickered, the shadows stretched, and then, very softly, the rice in the bowl began to steam, not from heat, but from memory. And with the steam came voices, children crying, mothers wailing, men coughing blood, and beneath it all, chanting. Broken, unfinished, the kind spoken by the dying to no one at all. The room grew cold, the air thick, and Luyenne began to cry, not out of fear, but because she now remembered things she never lived through. She remembered kneeling in mud with her own bones visible beneath her skin. She remembered holding a sister who never had a name. She remembered starving so badly that bark became food. She remembered dying and then waking again as herself, alone, in her home, with the rice still warm. That was the night she understood. The rice was no longer just cursed. It was a vessel, each grain a soul, each bite a death. And the only way to stop the hunger was to finish the story, to name the nameless, to feed what had never been fed, to remember what had been erased, even if it meant losing her mind, even if it meant losing herself.
It began with murmurs, soft, subtle, like someone whispering in the next room, too low to understand, but just loud enough to disturb. At first, Luan thought it was the wind, or the trees brushing against the house, or the creak of wood expanding under heat. But soon she realized it always happened when she stepped near the rice jar, not during storms, not during silence, only when she looked at it or thought of it. And the whispering grew clearer with each passing day. By the 5th morning, the voices began speaking her name. Luen. A single breath exhaled from somewhere deep inside the jar. She froze. Her name was never spoken gently. It came from the rice like a cry of recognition, like a long-lost child seeing its mother for the first time in centuries. She tried to ignore it. She covered the jar in cloth, then rope, then old burlap soaked in salt water. Still, every time she stepped near it, the grains shifted, as if something inside was breathing. Sometimes she swore she saw faces in the grains, small and round, pressing against the glass of the ceramic like children caught under ice. But the worst part wasn't the whispers, it was the memories. They began creeping in during her waking hours. Not dreams, not hallucinations, but vivid, embodied recall of things she had never lived. One afternoon, as she watered her altar plants, she suddenly dropped the jug and fell to her knees. Her hands trembled, her skin prickled, and in her mind's eye, she saw herself kneeling in the muck of a flooded rice field, naked, starving, fingers raw, nails missing, eating worms out of the soil to survive. Another day, she woke in her bed to find her legs bruised and scraped, mud on her feet, nails blackened, as if she had been crawling through something wet, through something sacred, through something remembered. The villagers started to notice. They stopped visiting. Children crossed the road when passing her house. One morning she found a string of garlic tied around her gate, a silent warning, or perhaps a desperate attempt to protect themselves from her. They did not understand. They couldn't. But she no longer blamed them, because she too had begun to fear her own reflection. Each night, the rice called louder, not in screams, but in stories, whispered, urgent tales of lives lived in darkness. A midwife who died delivering her own stillborn child under the plague moon. A crippled farmer who starved because his neighbors feared his breath was cursed. A boy who ate his own fingers before dying of fever in a shack made of straw and bone. These stories bled into her bones, into her breath, into her skin, until she could no longer tell which memories were hers and which belonged to the dead. On the 7th night, she broke. She lit the oil lamp, placed it near the jar, and sat in front of it, legs crossed like a child awaiting a bedtime story. If you want to speak, then speak. The room fell silent. Even the crickets stopped. Then, softly, the grains inside the jar began to rise, not float, not levitate, but stand, each grain upright, like tiny bodies coming to attention. And the whispering turned to wailing, voices, dozens of them, layered, overlapping, not angry, not malicious, just hungry, for acknowledgement, for remembrance, for home. And they began to speak to her,
not as one, but as many. She could not understand the words at first. They were in dialects older than memory, from tongues forgotten by modern maps. But her ears knew, her blood remembered. She stayed there all night, listening, sobbing, whispering back. She did not sleep, she simply received. And when morning came, she rose slowly and wrote down every name they gave her, every image, every wound, every prayer they had never had the breath to finish. She placed the list beside the altar, folded her hands, and whispered, "You are not forgotten." But the hunger did not stop. In fact, it grew worse. Her stomach gnawed at itself. Every meal not made from the rice left her weak. Other food, noodles, soup, vegetables, passed through her like water. She lost weight. Her eyes sunk. Her lips cracked. Only the rice fed her now, and she knew it. She tried to fight it, but each time she resisted, the voices screamed, the faces in the jar twisted, and the memories clawed harder, dragging her back into the trench, back into the silence beneath the world, back into the black earth where names go to rot. On the 9th night, she broke. She lit the oil lamp, placed it near the jar, and sat in front of it, legs crossed like a child awaiting a bedtime story. If you want to speak, then speak. With each spoonful of rice, she felt more and more connected to the lost souls, more willing to pass their memories to the world. And for the first time, she understood. The rice wasn't cursed. It was cursed to be forgotten. And she, the last woman foolish enough to eat it, had become their shrine, their altar, their voice, their vessel. And she could no longer stop, because they were no longer just whispering. They were inside her now, and they were always hungry.
The dead had claimed her, but not in death, in memory, in hunger, in silence. Till Yoon had stopped counting days, the sun rose and fell like a ritual she no longer participated in. Time to her had become irrelevant, because the past lived inside her now. It whispered through the walls, it stirred in her bowl, it breathed through the rice. And it would not rest, not until she remembered something that no one else would. It came in fragments. The name of a woman who had drowned during the plague, the scent of a burned offering snuffed out by rain, the image of a child's hand, not waving, not reaching, just floating. She wrote it all down, page after page, filling her house with notes, names, sketches, lists, like a madwoman trying to map a dream she never had. But amidst the noise, one detail repeated itself. The pact. They said it in different voices, in different dialects, but always it came back to the same phrase. They broke the pact, and we sank. She searched the house for answers, not in books, not in prayers, but in the hidden places where the living tried to forget the dead. Behind her husband's altar, she found an old wooden panel warped with age. She pried it loose. Inside, wrapped in red cloth, faded with time, was a ledger. Not a religious text, not a will, but a journal, handwritten in her grandfather's thin, looping script. She sat in the dim light of a single oil lamp, hands trembling as she turned the pages. It was a record, not of farming or trade, but of warnings. Each entry detailed boundaries marked in the field, offerings made at the edge of the southern trench,
annual rituals of appeasement, and one rule written again and again in crimson ink. Never harvest from the southern corner. The dead sleep there, and the pact keeps them fed. Her breath caught in her throat. She flipped to the final page. The handwriting was no longer neat. It was hurried, desperate. The war took too many. We could not uphold the pact this year. The rains destroyed the shrine. If we do not renew it, they will rise through the roots. May the next generation remember if we do not return. No signature, no date, just a smear of ink, as if the pen had slipped from a dying hand. Her son had harvested that land, not out of defiance, but ignorance. The trees had overgrown the markers. The shrine had collapsed into mud, and she, the last bearer of the family's memory, had not even known it existed. She pressed the journal to her chest and wept. But not just for herself. She wept for the forgotten promise, the buried shrine, the pact that had once kept the hungry dead quiet and had now been shattered. The next morning, she returned to the field, not to plant, not to reap, but to look, to see. She followed the journal's directions, 13 steps from the twisted banyan tree, 7 to the left of the broken altar stone. There in the tall grass she found it, a half-buried stone, etched with faded carvings, a circle of teeth, a bowl carved into the rock's surface, burnt incense sticks, ancient and crumbling, still stuck into the soil. The shrine, or what was left of it. She knelt before it, placed her hands into the stone bowl. Inside was rice, black, wet, still warm. She recoiled, but it was too late. Her palms burned. The rice clung to her skin like blood, and the whispers came again. The pact is broken. You must feed us, or we will feed on you. That night, her hands blistered. She couldn't hold chopsticks, could barely hold a spoon. So she ate from the bowl like an animal, desperate to quiet the screams in her head. And when she slept, she saw the rice fields drown, not in water, but in bodies. Dozens, hundreds, sinking into the soil like seeds, feeding the crops, feeding her. She woke to find footprints around her bed, small ones, like children. But the floor was dry, the door locked. She was not alone, but she was not with anyone either. The pact had tethered them once. Now they were free, and they were inside her home. She tried to warn the village, tried to tell them what her son had done, what she had done, but they didn't listen. They called her cursed, possessed, mad. They told her to stay away from the shrine, stay away from the fields. But it was too late for warnings, because the fields had already crept into her. They whispered through her breath, they stirred behind her eyes, and worst of all, they had begun to remember their names. She carved new tablets, dozens, left them on the broken shrine, but the wind blew them away. She poured bowls of rice along the field edge. The birds refused to eat. She chanted, she burned sage, she cried. Nothing worked, because a pact is not just a gesture, it is a contract. And to repair a broken contract, someone must pay, not with prayers, but with presence, with flesh, with blood. That night, she sat before the rice jar again, her hands still bandaged. She dipped a ladle into the rice and whispered, "I know what we broke. I will feed you until I remember every name." The rice shifted gently like water acknowledging the moon, and in that moment she heard it, not in her ears, but in her soul. One name, soft, lost, carried on the breath of famine. Mui. Just one word, but it shook her to the bone, because that was not a name she knew, but it knew her.
The name stayed with her, Mui. She whispered it under her breath as she stirred the pot. She scrawled it into the margins of her notebook. She muttered it in her sleep, the way a mother might say the name of a child she had lost long ago but could never forget. But Luen had never known anyone named Mui. No villager, no relative, and yet the name tasted familiar, not from her memory, from the rice. She began seeing visions again, more vivid, more embodied. This time, she wasn't just witnessing the dead, she was becoming them. When she closed her eyes, she was a young girl, kneeling in water up to her waist, tying rice bundles with trembling hands, her ribs visible beneath her skin. When she opened her eyes, her knees were bruised, soaked as if she'd been kneeling in mud all night. She stopped leaving the house. The outside world felt foreign, too loud, too alive. Inside, the rice jar waited, always full, always warm, always watching. Sometimes the grains shifted in unison, spelling shapes, forming faces. Other times they pulsed as if breathing. She no longer questioned it. She only watched and listened. She began hearing more names, not spoken aloud, but impressed upon her through smell, taste, sound. A whiff of burning incense would bring the image of a toothless woman named Ba Ling, who had died feeding her last bowl of rice to her grandson before collapsing in a puddle. A single grain pressed to her lips would summon the image of a one-eyed man crawling through the dirt with a broken ankle, dragging a sack of grain that would never reach his family. Each bite was a life, each bowl a grave. One evening, after swallowing a spoonful of rice that had boiled itself without fire, she collapsed against the altar and whispered, "I don't want to see anymore." But the jar pulsed, and the memories kept coming. That night, she saw Mui again, clearer than before. A young boy, barefoot, maybe 9, thin as bamboo, eyes sunken. He was trapped in a small shack made of dried grass and bone. Outside, plague bells rang. He pressed his face to the cracks in the wall, whispering for someone, anyone, to bring him food. No one came. Flies did, heat did, and eventually, death did. Luen woke with a scream caught in her throat. Sweat drenched her nightclothes. Her heart pounded, and beside her bed stood a pair of muddy, child-sized footprints leading from the doorway to the rice jar. She no longer lit incense, no longer made offerings. What would she offer? They had everything now. Her mind, her sleep, her breath. The rice didn't need permission. It was inside her, woven into the lining of her stomach, stitched into the folds of her memory. She would forget her own name before she forgot theirs. She tore through the house again, ripped open the floorboards,
searched for more journals, more fragments of the past. Behind a false wall near the kitchen hearth, she found a box. Inside, a photograph, yellowed with age. It showed her grandfather as a young man standing with a group of villagers. In the background, barely visible, was a small shrine, one she had never seen in real life. Beneath the photo was a scrap of paper written in trembling script. As long as the rice remembers, so will they. If we forget, we feed them differently. What did that mean? She read it again. If we forget, we feed them differently. She stared at the rice jar, then at her hands, thin, trembling. Was that what was happening now? The rice no longer waited for offerings. It no longer asked. It took her memories, her hunger, her flesh. That night, her hair began to fall out, not in clumps, just strands, a soft shedding. Her skin grew pale, waxy. Her reflection became blurred, not just by time, but by substitution. The face in the mirror began to change, just a little each day. Eyes too wide, cheekbones too sharp, skin too young. Sometimes it wasn't even her at all. Sometimes it was Mui. She tried to write down everything she saw, every name, every story, every death. But her hand cramped, her eyes blurred, and the ink bled into the pages like tears. The pages stuck to each other, damp with unseen moisture. One morning, she awoke to find her journal open, but not in her writing. New pages had been added, new stories, written in hands she did not recognize, signed with names she had only just begun to remember. They were writing through her now, using her hands, her breath, her body. She screamed into the night, "I don't want this! Let me go!" But the walls did not answer. The rice did. It boiled itself, bubbled, frothed, overflowed. Steam filled the house, the scent of memory, the perfume of death. And in that steam she saw them, shadowy shapes walking across her walls, some tall, some bent, some crawling, each holding a bowl, empty, waiting, watching. She fell to her knees, took a spoon, ate, and whispered, "I remember you." The rice turned sweet, almost warm, and a voice, faint and delicate, rose from her chest, not her own, but a child's. "Thank you." That night she slept without dreams, but in the morning her fingernails had turned black, and the journal on her desk now contained 3 new names she had never written, and one underlined 3 times in a child's shaky hand, Mui. The rice remembered everything, even what the world had chosen to forget, and now she did. But memory, she realized, is not a blessing, not when it is borrowed, not when it comes with teeth, not when every grain you swallow pulls you further from yourself, not when the dead are no longer content with just being remembered, but want to live again through you.
The shrine had rotted. The pact had been broken. The rice remembered. But remembrance was no longer enough. They wanted more. They wanted ritual. Tiluyen sat in silence for hours each day now, surrounded by bowls she no longer filled, candles she no longer lit. Her home smelled like mold, steam, and ash, the scent of prayers unanswered. The rice jar still pulsed faintly in the corner, not violently, not greedily, just patiently, like something waiting for her to give in completely. But she had begun to understand. This wasn't possession, it was communion. The price of feeding the nameless dead wasn't death, it was carrying them, breathing them, letting them remember through her tongue, her bones, her breath. But the more she gave, the more they demanded. The altar was no longer enough. They needed ceremony. They needed recognition. But how do you honor the unrecorded? How do you chant for those who had no names? How do you perform a ritual for the forgotten when there are no instructions left behind, only hunger? She went to the oldest monk in the district, a man called Master Teen, blind, ancient, and nearly deaf, but said to still speak the languages of both gods and ghosts. She brought him a small jar of rice, wrapped tightly. He touched it once, then he recoiled. "This rice has been touched by those who died without fire. Can you help me?" "No." "Please." "No one can help you," he said, "but I can tell you what must be done." They sat beneath an altar heavy with dust and lotus petals. The monk spoke slowly, voice like wind scraping across old stone. "The dead who are named can be buried. They can be guided. They can be fed with words and incense. But the nameless, they do not go anywhere. They linger. They rot. They reach for mouths that will never say their names. When a pact is broken, they do not punish. They simply hunger." Luyen's hands trembled. "What do they want from me?" The monk leaned close. "They want to be brought to the table, just once, as if they were loved." "But I don't know who they are." "You don't need to. You must make a feast for the forgotten." "Where?" "At the edge of the field where they were buried." "What should I offer?" "Rice, salt, water, fire, and your voice." She returned home with the monk's words etched into her mind like scripture. That night, she prepared for the ritual. Not a temple ceremony, not a Buddhist chant, something older, more primal, a meal for ghosts. She carved new bowls from bamboo. She filled them with rice from the jar, the cursed, sacred rice that moved when touched. She boiled water from the stream that flowed past the burial field. She caught a fish with her bare hands, whispering apologies as she crushed it against a stone. She brewed tea from dried flowers she'd never planted, but had grown around the old shrine. And lastly, she took a strand of her own hair and wound it around the offering plates. Bloodline, remembrance, sacrifice. She carried it all in a woven basket and walked barefoot to the southern edge of the field. Night had already fallen. Mist rolled low across the paddies like breath held in grief. She found the shrine, laid the offerings down, and lit the candles. Then she knelt in the mud and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. No wind, no sound, just the stillness of a world holding its breath. Then the flames flickered sideways, not with breeze, but intention. A cold passed through her skin. The mist thickened, and the earth beneath her knees began to warm and rise and pulse like breath, like life, like something waking up. The voices returned, dozens, hundreds, layered, grieving, hungry. They did not cry, they chanted. With her, through her. She opened her mouth to speak, but it wasn't her voice that came out. It was theirs, a single word, repeated like prayer, like drumbeat. Moy kum,
Moikum, moikum. The phrase used to call ancestors to eat, a sacred summoning, now whispered by those who had no place at any table. She wept, but the tears weren't hers, they were remembered. And then it stopped. The candles went out, the bowls emptied, the fish rotted instantly, the tea turned black, the rice bled. Red seeped from the grains, flowing into the earth, soaking her knees. And the voices fell silent. Only one remained, a child, soft, trembling. "Why now?" She didn't answer, couldn't. The voice repeated, "Why now? Why didn't you come before?" Then silence. She rose in the dark, numb, empty, but not alone. Because something had followed her back from that field. She felt it in her breath, in her blood, in her shadow which no longer matched her body exactly. She had fed the dead, but they had not been satisfied. Back in her house, she knelt before the rice jar. The grains were still, dry, dead-looking, but her hand trembled, not from fear, from withdrawal. She was hungry, starving, but no food satisfied, only that rice. She lifted the lid, scooped a handful, and ate, and with every grain she heard them again, not screaming now, just breathing, inside her, through her, like a home they had never known, now made of flesh and bone. But this time, when she reached for a second handful, the rice pulled back.
The second handful didn't reach her mouth. The rice in her palm pulsed, once, then slithered like something alive. She dropped it with a gasp. It hit the floor silently, but didn't scatter. It crawled. Dozens of grains spilled out of the jar, wriggling across the floorboards like maggots born of memory. Some formed shapes, circles, eyes, names half-written and erased. Others simply stopped, as if waiting to be noticed. She backed away, and the rice followed. That night, Lulien did not eat. Her stomach clawed at itself, but the hunger had changed. It wasn't only hers, it was shared. 100 mouths inside her body demanding more memory, more pain, more ritual. She understood now. The offering had not been a gesture of peace. It had been an invitation, a door opened, not to free the dead, but to let them in. They had tasted remembrance. Now they wanted embodiment. Not in story, not in prayer, in flesh. At midnight, her door opened without wind. The rice jar tipped over on its own. Grains poured across the floor, lining the hallway like a procession, leading her, calling her, to the altar, to the pot, to the feast. She followed, barefoot, silent, half asleep, half possessed. Her hands moved without her consent, lighting incense she hadn't placed, arranging bowls she hadn't filled. Each action familiar, but wrong. A mockery of ancestral rites, a ritual not for honoring the dead, but for becoming them. She boiled the rice. Steam rose in thick clouds clinging to the walls, the ceiling, her skin. Inside the fog, she saw them, not clearly, like shadows behind frosted glass. Some limped, some crawled, some carried bowls. Others bore nothing, just open mouths and hollow eyes. They didn't reach for her. They waited,
expected, and she, trembling, crying, began to serve. She placed bowls at each corner of the room, one for the mother who fed her child poison so he wouldn't starve slower than her, one for the crippled man who died dragging his dead sister to the shrine, one for the blind girl buried alive by neighbors who thought her coughing was a curse, one for the child, Mui, who had never been named aloud until she spoke it, and one for the others, the hundreds whose stories she hadn't yet been forced to remember, but would. She sat in the center of the room. The rice steamed before her. Blood pooled beneath each bowl, not from cuts, but from the rice itself, seeping red. She opened her mouth and chanted. Not her words, theirs. Her voice changed, pitch warping, vowels bending unnaturally. Ancient dialects she had never studied spilled from her lips like water breaking through a dam. The house moaned, the roof strained, candles flared, then died, snuffed not by wind, but by presence. And then she stopped, eyes wide, mouth open. A sound filled the room. Chewing. Not hers. Not from her own mouth, but all around her. Dozens of mouths, invisible, wet, greedy, feasting, savoring. Finally, remembered. Then came the child's voice, so soft it was nearly mistaken for breath. It's not enough. Luyen turned slowly toward the altar. A single grain floated in the air, spinning, then dropped onto the offering plate, followed by another and another, until a mound of rice built itself into a small moving pile. From it, something rose, a head, then a torso, a child shape, featureless and damp, composed entirely of cursed rice. Eyes opened, hollow, bleeding steam. The figure tilted its head and whispered, "You opened the door. Now you must stay with us or take our place." Luyen fell back, choking on panic, on smoke, on the overwhelming scent of steamed blood and burning hair. "Please," she gasped, "I've done everything." "You fed us once. Now feed us always." The walls cracked, the floor swelled, and beneath the house something moved. Roots? No. Hands, dozens of them, reaching up through the soil, not to drag her under, to join her, to offer their limbs, their bones, their skin, to become her, or to let her become them. She screamed and tried to run, but the floor split, the boards broke, and she fell into the space below her house, where only darkness lived and rice. Tons of it, black, wet, heaving like lungs. It welcomed her, covered her, entered her mouth, her eyes, her ears. She couldn't breathe, but didn't need to. She was no longer separate. She was no longer hungry. She was part of the feast. At dawn, the house was quiet. No rice on the floor, no bowls on the altar, just the jar, sealed, unmoving, full. And in the center of the room, Luyen knelt, eyes open, unblinking, steam rising from her skin, a smile curling at the corners of her mouth, not her smile. She rose slowly, tilted her head, and in a voice that wasn't hers, whispered, "We are full. For now."
The village said nothing. They never do. Not when someone breaks. Not when someone burns offerings at the wrong altar. Not when someone disappears from themselves. They only glance, whisper, move on. And so no one questioned why Tiluen now walked barefoot through the fields before sunrise, hands streaked with mud, face tilted toward the wind as if listening for something long gone. No one dared ask why she no longer responded to her name, why she hummed old lullabies in dialects no one had heard in decades, or why her shadow no longer matched her steps. She had not slept in days, and yet her body moved with unnatural precision, each motion like ritual, her spine rigid, her gaze unblinking. At night, she sat in the doorway of her house, speaking into the dark, sometimes to the trees, sometimes to nothing at all, sometimes to the rice. It had changed. The jar no longer steamed. It throbbed, a soft, rhythmic pulse, like breath held just beneath the lid. Sometimes it rocked gently. Sometimes it giggled. Once it screamed, but only briefly, then fell back into its steady beat. And Luen, or the thing wearing her shape, would hum in response, gently tapping the lid like one might calm a restless child. The villagers saw her digging near the burial field, not farming, just digging. Deep holes, bare hands, nails broken, fingers bleeding. She never planted, never buried anything, just stared into the earth, as if waiting for something to climb out. The animals knew before the people did. Dogs barked at her door, then refused to go near. Chickens scattered at her scent. Even insects avoided the air around her. And children, the ones still too young to lie, began waking from sleep screaming her name, claiming she stood at the foot of their beds, smiling with someone else's teeth. Inside the house, everything changed. She had removed the family altar, replaced it with a mound of bowls, stacked, polished, all facing east. There were no photos, no incense, only rice, laid out like bones, cooked, cold, glistening. And in the center, a single hollowed-out skull. No one knew where it came from, but it was always full, always steaming. One evening, she hosted a meal. No one was invited, but the door was open, and the scent of rice drifted through the village like perfume laced with grief. Old women crossed themselves. Young men spat at the ground, but no one entered, until a boy, no more than 7, wandered in, drawn by hunger, by the promise of food. He was never seen again, but that night the rice jar was fuller than ever, and Luen's eyes glowed softly like coals buried beneath ash. People began whispering that she was no longer human, that something had taken root, not a ghost, not a curse, something older, a memory given body, a hunger wrapped in skin. She still wore her own face, but it was stretched thin, like a mask trying too hard to smile. In private, she performed the rituals, her version of them, feeding bowls to no one, chanting names that didn't exist, bowing before shadows. And at night, she danced,
slow circular motions around the rice jar, arms raised, feet bleeding. Each step matched the beat of a distant drum that no one else could hear. Then came the day she no longer spoke at all, only whispered, only in other voices, men's voices, children's voices, a chorus that drifted from her throat like wind through a graveyard. Some begged, some laughed, some simply repeated one word over and over: more. One morning a monk arrived from the lowlands. He had heard rumors, dreams, warnings. He carried salt, incense, prayer beads. He entered her home. He never came out. But that night, a new bowl was added to the altar, his rosary draped across it, each bead cracked like tiny skulls. The villagers wanted to burn the house, but none could step past the gate. Something held them back, something old, something that spoke in rice, something that watched them from behind Luen's eyes and remembered their grandparents' sins. So they left her alone, because they knew she was not just one anymore. She was many. Inside her they sang, not in melody, but in need. Each step she took was a borrowed memory, each breath a name recalled. She no longer needed to eat. The rice fed her. She no longer needed to sleep. The dreams walked for her. She no longer needed to remember, because they did. They remembered everything, and through her body, they were no longer forgotten. Possession, the elders say, is not always violent. Sometimes it begins with a hunger. Sometimes it begins with a prayer unanswered. And sometimes it begins with a single grain of rice, eaten without knowing, swallowed without fear, and ends when you forget where your body ends and theirs begins.
He came to her in silence, not with weeping, not with hunger, with recognition. She was in the fields again, barefoot, staring at the place where her son had died, the southern edge, where no one farmed before him, where the grass grew thick, too green for its own good. And then she saw him, a boy, no taller than her waist, standing among the stalks, unmoving, thin, shadowed, dust-colored, eyes dark and wide, like pools that had seen nothing and everything all at once. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because she had seen him before, in dreams, in bowls, in the whisper that lived inside her chest. Mui, the child with no name, given one by a woman who never meant to invite him. And yet she had, not with malice, but with food, with breath, with blood. He tilted his head. His mouth didn't move, but his voice arrived anyway, inside her spine, inside her stomach. "You remember me?" She nodded slowly. "I didn't mean to." "But you did. You were just a vision." "I was forgotten." He stepped closer. The rice beneath his feet bent but did not break. Each blade curved around him as if mourning. "You ate the rice." "Yes." "Then I am in you now." Her breath caught.
What do you want from me? He blinked. Once, then twice. To exist. She didn't understand, but he kept speaking. His words brittle, measured, like a lullaby sung through cracked lips. I lived in a hut no bigger than a pig cage. My father was dead. My mother buried me herself before the plague took her too. No one lit incense. No one called my name. I never even had one until you said it. She swallowed hard. Mui. He flinched, then smiled, and in that moment she saw all of him. The boy, the corpse, the spirit, the hunger. He was not evil, not malicious. He was memory made flesh. And now that she had remembered him, he refused to return to silence. You offered a feast, he whispered. Yes, but only one. I tried to. You don't understand, he interrupted. I don't want offerings. His face darkened. His voice turned to ash. I want a life. That night she dreamed of his burial. The earth was wet, the hole shallow. He was wrapped in a mat of reeds. No chants, no tears, just wind. She was the one burying him, but not as herself, as someone else. A woman's whose name had long been scraped away. Perhaps a mother, perhaps not. The dream bled into waking, and when she opened her eyes, her bed was covered in rice stalks and damp soil, and at the foot of her mattress, written in tiny red grains, "Let me stay." She stopped resisting. She allowed him to speak through her mouth, to see through her eyes, to move through her limbs. Sometimes she woke in strange positions, curled like a child, face pressed into the floor. Sometimes she didn't wake at all, just blinked and realized hours had passed. Once she found herself humming a lullaby she never learned, in a dialect no one had spoken in 100 years, and outside the window, the rice in the fields bowed toward her in rows, as if listening. Mui began appearing more often, not just in dreams, in reflections, in the steam of her rice pot, in the wet handprints left on her table. He was always silent, but never far, and her body had become his lantern. One evening she lit no candles. She simply sat in the dark. He appeared beside her, this time closer, tangible. He placed his hand in hers, impossibly cold, and said, "I will carry you." "Until when?" she asked, voice trembling. "Until I am remembered by more than just you." "I can write your story." Stories fade. He looked at her with eyes too large for his face, but bodies last longer. She realized then he didn't want freedom, he wanted residency, not to cross over, but to stay, to fill the space of her bones, to live a second life inside a body never meant for him. "I am not your home," she whispered. "You made me a guest. Now I am making you a room." Her stomach turned, not from fear, but from understanding. Possession wasn't a seizure. It was a nest, a patient construction, and she had already laid the foundation, grain by grain, memory by memory, name by name. That night she woke with her voice speaking before her mind caught up, reciting names, dozens, hundreds, none of them hers. Her reflection blinked when she didn't, and her breath came in hiccups like a child stifling sobs in the dark. And in the mirror just behind her, Mui smiled. He would never leave, because she had given him remembrance. And remembrance to the dead is a kind of life. She had eaten the rice, and in doing so, had invited him to stay forever.
The harvest moon rose blood orange, heavy, watching. It hovered low above the paddies, casting long shadows over the rice fields, shadows that moved even when the wind did not. It was the season of offerings. In the village, preparations began before sunrise. Women scrubbed altars. Children tied red threads around incense bundles. Men shaped paper money into boats, horses, towers, destined to burn for the ancestors. The Lekomai, the festival of new rice. It was meant to bless the yield, to thank the dead, to close the gates between the world of the living and the hungry. But this year, the gates would not close, because they had already been left wide open. Tit Lien watched from a distance as the villagers gathered at the temple grounds. They avoided her gaze. Their chants were quiet, their drums hesitant. They sensed something was wrong, but no one dared name it. Instead, they repeated their rituals with shallow breath, burning offerings with trembling hands, casting glances over their shoulders. The air was thick, not with mist, but with presence, the kind that clung to the back of your throat like unspoken guilt, the kind that turned prayer into ash. At the center of the temple, the elder priest stepped forward, lifting the ceremonial bowl of rice to the altar. But before he could speak, the rice blackened instantly. Rot spread across the bowl like mold in fast motion. The grains hissed, then bled. A crimson trickle ran down the elder's wrist. He dropped the bowl with a cry. It shattered, and inside it, something moved. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Tit Lien stepped forward. Not as a villager, not as herself, as host. Eyes hollow, voice steady. She walked barefoot across the stones, kneeling beside the broken bowl, scooping up the bleeding rice with her bare hands, whispering, "You forgot them. They remember you." She stood, faced the crowd, and smiled. They began to murmur. Some backed away. A child screamed. The priest shouted for her to stop, but his voice cracked mid-command as if choked by unseen hands. Then the wind arrived. Sudden, circular, violent. Lanterns burst. Incense flew from altars. Paper horses burned too fast, too loud, collapsing into ash before they could be blessed. And from the temple floor, they rose. Shadows shaped like people. Dozens, cloaked in steam and memory. No faces, only hollow mouths, open, starving. The crowd screamed, but their legs would not move. Their limbs locked, their breath stolen. And the shadows passed through them, not touching, but taking. Each spirit inhaled the scent of a life once lived and fed on the parts that were forgotten. A grandfather's name, a child's lullaby, a wife's face long buried beneath years of silence. Each spirit took what had been denied, remembrance, and grew stronger. Luen lifted her arms, and the spirits gathered around her like birds returning to a familiar tree. Tonight, she said, they join the table. No more bowls left empty, no more graves without names. And the dead danced, slow, swirling, a grotesque mimicry of the harvest celebration. Only their music was the sound of weeping, of coughing, of bones rattling in shallow soil, and Luen moved with them, not possessed, not forced, willing, smiling, gone. Some villagers collapsed. Some fell to their knees, chanting names they hadn't spoken in decades. A few lit incense again, not for ancestors, but for strangers, hoping perhaps that one of the spirits might adopt the smoke and go quietly. None did. They lingered, because now they were invited. Then came the boy, Mui, emerging from the shadows, his shape sharper now, more solid. He walked barefoot to the altar, picked up a fresh bowl of white rice, raised it to his lips, ate for the first time. And every spirit around him stopped, watching, breathing, satisfied. Luen dropped to her knees, exhausted, eyes rolled back, and the boy turned to her and whispered, "Now we are part of the season. Now we will never be forgotten again." The moon watched silently. The last candle flickered, and the temple floor was covered in muddy footprints that didn't match the number of living souls present. The festival ended before sunrise. No drums were played, no blessings spoken. No one harvested the next morning. The rice field stood still, as if listening, as if waiting, as if counting. Back in her home, Luen sat at the altar she had once dismantled. It was whole again, but not hers. Photos of strangers, bowls with names carved into the wood, candles made of bone wax, and at the center, the rice jar, covered in cloth, silent, still, but full, always full. She placed a bowl before it, not for herself, but for them, and outside her window, the wind carried a new sound, not whispering, not wailing, but chewing. Hundreds of mouths, remembered, fed, and never leaving again.
It began with the shadows. They stopped obeying. At first it was small things, the candlelight flickering sideways, yet casting no shape behind her hand. Then her reflection in the window stopped blinking when she did. And finally, the shadows disappeared entirely. Not faded, not dimmed, gone. Luen lit every lantern in her home, but the walls stayed blank. She moved her arms, nothing followed. Her body gave no shape, no outline, no presence. The house had stopped recognizing her. Outside, dusk came as it always did, orange bleeding into gray. But inside, time ceased. Light hovered, unanchored. Darkness pressed at the windows but refused to cross the threshold. Even the air felt suspended, heavy, like breath held too long. There was no past, no future, only now, stretched infinitely thin. And the rice jar, still full, sat in the center of it all, quiet, waiting, watching. Luen stopped sleeping, not from fear, from dislocation. The house no longer offered rest. She would lie in bed and feel movement beneath the floorboards, not footsteps, but shifting, like something adjusting itself under the foundation. Sometimes she awoke standing,
or not at all, just blinking between moments. She had lost the thread of time, and her skin began to pale, not sickly, more like bleached parchment, a surface meant for others to write upon. Visitors stopped coming. Even birds no longer nested on her roof. She received no letters, no knocks, no sounds except for the occasional clink of a bowl moving on its own, or the distant chewing, always soft, always rhythmic, always echoing from beneath the house. The worst was the mirror. She had only one left, cracked, narrow, hung beside the stove. It never showed her face, not anymore. Only glimpses, fingers that weren't hers, mouths behind her shoulder, eyelids blinking sideways. Once she leaned in to examine her face and saw a child standing inside the glass, holding a bowl of rice with both hands, smiling with a mouthful of teeth too large for her jaw. When she turned around, no one. When she turned back, the mirror was gone. Just an empty frame, and rice seeping down the wall like blood from a head wound. She tried to cleanse the space. She boiled salt water. She lit camphor and waved it in figure eights. She whispered the chants she learned as a child, but every time the house seemed to swallow her prayers, like it had grown a throat and was hungry. One night she brought in a ritual healer, a younger man from a neighboring village. He was confident, fresh-faced, carried a staff carved with old symbols. He stepped into her home with 3 things: a bundle of lemongrass, a jar of oil, and a bell. He left with none, because he never walked out at all. She watched as he lit the oil, touched it to his forehead, and rang the bell 3 times. The sound echoed too long, too sharp, as if it had struck something inside the walls. He stopped, his eyes unfocused, then widened, and he fell to his knees. It's not a house, it's a mouth. He began clawing at his ears, then his eyes. She tried to stop him, but he didn't seem to see her, just kept repeating, "It's feeding on light, on time, on me." Then he screamed once, high and wet, and went still. Mouth open, eyes hollow, skin pale, as if he had been boiled from the inside out. She buried him behind the house, but in the morning the grave was empty, and a bowl sat on her altar, full of rice, still warm. She stopped lighting candles. What was the point? Light had no purpose in a house with no shadows. The air inside no longer moved. There were no seasons, no breeze, no change. Just the static hum of presence, heavy, dense, ancient, a pressure that filled the lungs without mercy. Sometimes she heard whispers behind the walls, not voices, instructions. Push the bowl to the left, bow twice before entering the kitchen, never turn your back to the rice jar. She obeyed them without question. Her body moved before thought. She no longer remembered what normal felt like, only compliance, only ritual. One evening she opened a door that hadn't existed before. It led to a room that didn't belong. Empty, dirt floor, walls lined with hanging rice stalks tied with red thread. In the center, a pit, and from within that pit steam rose, smelling of burnt offerings and wet teeth. She stepped back and closed the door.
When she opened it again the next day, it was gone. The house was no longer a house. It was a vessel, a body-shaped structure for the dead, a host for the forgotten, a place where time didn't flow, it stagnated, where light didn't fall, it was consumed, where names didn't echo, they were stored. And Luend? She was the keeper now, not just of memory, but of space, of threshold, of the place between living and no longer being. Her body housed the stories, but the house, it held the rest, all of them. Every unspoken name, every unfinished prayer, every bite of rice left uneaten by ancestors too long ignored. They had made a home of her home, and now no shadow would fall inside it again, because shadows only exist when light has somewhere to land. And in this house, light had been eaten.
She awoke to silence, but it was not peace. It was expectation. The kind of quiet that settles in just before a storm breaks open the sky. Her mouth was dry. Her bones felt hollow. Her skin thin as paper. And still, she rose, not out of strength, out of ritual, because today she would cook the final bowl. The rice jar sat waiting, still full, still warm, though no fire had touched it in days. She removed the cloth covering. This time it didn't resist. It welcomed her, like breath returning to lungs. She scooped a handful into the old pot, added water, placed it on the stove. There was no flame, yet it boiled. The scent filled the room, not of food, but of earth and time and forgotten lullabies. And underneath it all, rot. As the rice cooked, she prepared the space. She swept the floor 3 times, always east to west. She tied her hair with black thread. She laid out 5 bowls in a circle, and one in the center, the keeper's bowl, her bowl. She poured water from the burial well behind her house, water that tasted of iron and old promises. She lit no candles. The room glowed anyway, from something inside the walls, or perhaps inside her. When the rice was ready, she did not stir it. She let it settle, let it choose. The top layer was white, soft, comforting, but beneath it, black, red-veined, flesh-like. She scooped from the bottom, only from the bottom. She placed 1 spoonful into each bowl, and the last, the 13th spoonful, into hers. She sat cross-legged before them. The air grew thick, wet. The house groaned, and the walls seemed to breathe. She whispered, "Come." And they did, not in form, but in feeling. A heaviness descending into the room, filling it, soaking it, until it felt like she was sitting inside a body. She raised her bowl, her hands barely strong enough to hold it, and before eating, she sang. The melody came from nowhere, but her mouth knew the notes. A lullaby without words, carried from grave to grave by those who were never mourned properly. As she sang, the rice began to move. It pulsed, softly, like a heart. Then slowly she ate. 1 bite, then 2. By the 3rd, her vision blurred. By the 4th, she could feel them, not just around her, inside her. Faces flashed across her mind. The boy with the bloated belly, the girl who died mid-prayer, the man who tried to name every ancestor before his lungs collapsed, the mother who nursed her baby until both were cold.
one after another after another. And then, at the very end, came the child, Murray. He stood before her again, solid now, fully formed, not a ghost, not a shadow, but present. He stepped forward, knelt before her, placed his small hands over hers, and whispered, "You remembered." She tried to nod, but her body no longer responded. He smiled, soft, almost shy, then placed his forehead to hers and said, "Now I'll remember you." Her hands dropped. The bowl fell but never touched the ground. It hovered, then vanished like steam. Her body swayed once, then stilled. No final gasp, no cry, only release. But she did not die, not in the way mortals do. Her breath faded, her name softened, her skin cooled, but something of her remained, anchored in the rice, in the walls, in the altar, in every bowl the house would ever serve again. She had become the final piece of the offering, the last keeper, the memory that would feed others. Outside, the sky broke into rain, a soft, weeping drizzle. The rice fields bowed low, and in the southern corner, where no one planted anymore, fresh shoots began to rise, pale, unnatural, glowing faintly. Each one curved gently toward her house, toward the door, toward the pot still warm on the stove. In the house, a new altar stood, simple, empty, except for one thing, a single name carved into the wood. Not Mue, not one of the forgotten, but hers, Nyun, the woman who remembered, the woman who fed the dead, the woman who became the last bowl.
There are places that hum when no one is listening, places where the soil remembers what the living forget, where silence is not absence, but accumulation. The southern field grew wild again. No hands touched it after the festival. No sickle, no sandal, no offering. Only wind passed through. Only wind and whispers. It bloomed unnaturally. Rice stalks taller than a man. Leaves that curled like fingers reaching skyward. At night, the field glowed faintly, not with light, but with attention, as if something beneath the earth was watching the stars, waiting for them to look back. The villagers no longer spoke her name, not from fear, from respect. They called the house the still home, never entered, never disturbed, but sometimes they left a bowl of rice near the gate, just in case memory still needed feeding. Children born after that season never knew Huyen, but some said they saw her in dreams, a woman with silver hair and silent eyes, standing in the field, counting stalks that whispered like voices underwater. Others claimed to see her silhouette at dusk, walking among the plants, hand in hand with a child, always the same child, small, barefoot, smiling. No one dared plant near the southern edge then, but one year a traveler, unaware of the stories, tried. He cut back the wild growth, found the soil oddly soft, rich. He dug, and beneath the first layer of earth, he struck something hard, not stone, not bone, wood. Small planks, rows of them, each hand-carved with names, hundreds, weather-worn but legible, names no one in the village recognized, names not recorded in any census, names of the nameless.
He left that night, and the next morning the rice had regrown, fully, as if nothing had been touched. But a new name had appeared on the edge of the field, carved into a blackened stake. His name, his date of birth, but no death. Not yet. And so the villagers understood. The pact had returned, but changed. The field was not cursed. It was consecrated, not by monks, but by memory, by sacrifice, by the woman who ate the dead and remembered them into being. Eventually, the field became a place of pilgrimage, not with processions, not with song, but with silence. Strangers came and sat in the grass. Some wept, some ate a bowl of rice, then left quietly. Some stayed until the rice sprouted around their feet, as if the field itself had begun to claim them, not out of malice, out of welcome. The house still stands, crooked, weathered, its doors open, always. Inside there is only one room, one pot, one altar, and one chair, worn, smooth, gently rocking. And at the center of the altar, the rice jar, still full, still warm, still pulsing with the weight of the past. No one knows how it refills. No one dares to test it. But those who enter hungry leave full, not in the belly, in the soul. Because each grain now carries a name, and each name is spoken in silence. And in that silence, the dead are not gone, they are home. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear them, whispering through the rice, "Mercum, Mercum, come eat, come remember." Because remembrance is not a gift, it is a debt, and the price for forgetting was paid by a woman with no shadow, by a boy with no name, by a house that became a shrine, by a field that grew not from rain, but from grief. So if you pass through the north of Vietnam, and the sun is low, and the rice waves without wind, don't follow the sound. Don't look for the child. Don't answer the whispers, unless you mean it, unless you're ready to carry them, to feed them, to remember them forever.